The morning had dawned in St. Mary Mead with an almost imperceptible blush on the horizon, the kind of gentle sunrise that promised a perfectly ordinary day. Birds chattered in the hedgerows, and the roses in the village green seemed to lean towards the sun, as if eager to witness the events of the day. Mrs. Emily Tressilian, one of the more socially active ladies of the village, had spared no expense in preparing for her annual summer garden party, a tradition that had been delightfully unremarkable for over a decade. The lawns were immaculately trimmed, the tables gleaming with white linen, and the air redolent with the scent of freshly baked scones and lavender. A string quartet had been hired for the occasion, and the villagers, dressed in their finest, drifted in with smiles and polite conversation. Miss Marple, seated quietly on a wrought iron bench near a bed of peonies, observed all with her usual gentle attentiveness. It was a remarkable day, precisely because it seemed so perfectly ordinary. That, she thought, was often the prelude to disruption. Mrs. Tressilian greeted each guest with her usual brisk enthusiasm. Among the arrivals were Dr. Peter Barnaby, whose booming laugh had once frightened the local children but now lent a comforting familiarity. Young Mr. Edward Harper, the rector's nephew, known for his nervous energy and fondness for pocket watches. And Mrs. Lydia Carmichael, a widow whose sharp tongue and sharper wit were almost legendary in the village. As tea was served, the conversation meandered along its usual paths. Local gossip, complaints about the weather, and speculations about who might be awarded the village flower show's first prize. Miss Marple, however, found her attention drifting to subtler details. The way Mrs. Carmichael's gloved hand trembled when she laughed, the almost imperceptible glance Dr. Barnaby cast at his pocket watch, and the slight scowl that appeared whenever young Mr. Harper tried to join a conversation beyond his social comfort zone. It was the sizzle of something unexpected, a discordant note in the otherwise harmonious morning that first drew Miss Marple's attention. A sharp cry shattered the polite clinking of teacups. Guests turned in alarm to see Mrs. Tressilian standing rigidly beside the garden fountain, her face pale, eyes wide. In the center of the carefully raked gravel lay the motionless body of Mr. Alfred Kensington, a visitor from London who had only arrived in the village the previous week. He was sprawled unnaturally, a silver letter opener protruding grotesquely from his chest. For a moment, no one moved, as though the village itself had held its breath. Then the shrill voices began, cries of horror, gasps, and the sudden rustling of skirts and jackets as people sought safety or a vantage point. Miss Marple remained seated, her knitting needles paused mid-air. She did not startle, nor did she show the slightest outward sign of panic. Instead, she took a slow, measured breath and studied the scene before her. The guests were clustering in small groups, each speculating wildly, yet there was something in the way Mr. Kensington had fallen, something about the positioning of the letter opener, that suggested a deliberate, almost personal act. "Ah," Miss Marple murmured under her breath, more to herself than anyone else. It is rarely the stranger who is truly in danger in a place like this. Somewhere beneath the polite shock and the whispered gossip, the first threads of mystery had begun to weave themselves, and in the corner of her mind, Miss Marple began her quiet, inexorable work, observing, noting, and waiting as she always did, for the little things that no one else could see. The garden party, which had begun with such serene promise, was now irrevocably changed, and Miss Marple, as ever, was perfectly poised to see what others could not. The village of St. Mary Mead had never seen such commotion. Within moments, the garden that had been so serene a few minutes earlier was transformed into a buzz of whispered theories, startled glances, and nervous laughter that did not reach the eyes of the speakers. Mrs. Tressilian clutched at her pearls as if they might steady her heart, while the string quartet hastily packed away their instruments, the music left dangling in the warm summer air. "Who could have done such a thing?" Mrs. Carmichael demanded, her voice sharp as though by declaring the obvious she might summon an answer. "A London gentleman in our little village. It's unthinkable." Dr. Barnaby, ever practical even in moments of shock, knelt beside the body, gently pressing a hand to the man's wrist. He frowned and shook his head. "I'm afraid it is too late. He is gone. But we must not jump to conclusions." His eyes flicked briefly toward the cluster of younger men hovering near the garden gate, including Edward Harper, whose pale face and restless movements betrayed both fear and confusion. Voices rose in overlapping speculation. Some suggested it must have been a robbery gone wrong, though nothing of value appeared disturbed. Others hinted at an old vendetta despite the victim's recent arrival. Miss Marple, seated on her bench, said nothing. She listened with her usual quiet intensity, letting the words of others drift past her while noting far subtler clues. The faint smell of garden soil clinging to someone's shoes, a smear of lipstick on the edge of a teacup, the way a hand trembled when lifted too high. The local constable, a diligent but rather nervous man named Inspector Cray, arrived shortly, summoned by a neighbor who had witnessed the gathering unravel. Cray looked from face to face, attempting to impose order, though it was clear the villagers' gossip would not be so easily controlled. "I will need statements from everyone present," he said, though his tone carried an undertone of relief, as though part of him secretly hoped the murder might have a simple solution. "Please remain calm and stay where you are until I have spoken to you individually." Miss Marple gave a faint nod of acknowledgement, as if she were merely commenting on the weather. She rose slowly, allowing her eyes to sweep over the scene once more. The placement of Mr. Kensington's body, the position of the letter opener, the faint scuff marks along the gravel path. They all whispered secrets that the villagers were too startled to see. It was Edward Harper who first made a clumsy attempt to approach Mrs. Tressilian. I didn't see anything, I swear," he stammered, his hands twisting nervously. "I was by the rose beds. I didn't touch anything." Mrs. Tressilian's face was a mask of distress. "Edward, child, you mustn't wander off," she said, her voice breaking slightly. "What will people think if—" She paused, realizing that in truth, what people thought was now almost irrelevant. Meanwhile, Mrs. Carmichael moved among the guests like a sharp-eyed hawk, quietly questioning anyone who would listen. "You saw nothing? Come now. We all know London men are not used to village ways. Perhaps he had enemies already waiting to greet him." Her words sparked murmurs of agreement, as though mere suggestion might suffice for a motive. Miss Marple observed all this in silence, noting each twitch, glance, and whispered speculation. One small detail struck her quietly: the angle of the letter opener, the faint disturbance of soil near the fountain, and the subtle impressions of someone's shoe on the grass. To anyone else, these were trivial, perhaps meaningless, but to her they formed a pattern she could not yet fully articulate. As the villagers began to disperse under the polite authority of Inspector Cray, whispers trailing behind them, Miss Marple remained seated a moment longer. Her mind worked gently, untangling the threads of human behavior that would, she knew, eventually reveal the truth. People were rarely what they appeared to be, she thought. It was in their small gestures, their unguarded expressions, and their hasty words that the real story hid. And in St. Mary Mead, hidden beneath the polite veneers of tea parties and summer dresses, a dangerous truth had just begun to emerge. By late afternoon, the initial shock had begun to settle into a more controlled, if uneasy, rhythm. Inspector Cray had established a cordon around the garden, politely preventing villagers from crossing the threshold, while scribbling notes and occasionally asking questions that were met with nervous stammers or defensive denials. The villagers themselves had retreated to clusters along the hedges and beneath the shade of the old oak, speaking in low tones that Miss Marple, of course, overheard with remarkable clarity. "I tell you, it must be someone from London," Mrs. Carmichael whispered to a friend, her eyes darting about. "No one here in St. Mary Mead has such boldness." He would have been safe in any village, yet he was targeted immediately. "Perhaps it was not boldness, but opportunity," murmured another, a middle-aged woman with a shawl tightly wound around her shoulders. "He arrived only last week. Who knew his habits, his routines? Someone could have waited." "Enough speculation," Miss Marple interjected softly, as if commenting on the weather. Her voice was calm, unassuming, but carried an authority that made the speaker pause mid-sentence. She did not speak to accuse. She merely noted, observed, and encouraged the threads of conversation to reveal themselves. People often disclosed more than they intended when they felt they were being merely conversational. She noticed Edward Harper lingering at the edge of the gathering, wringing his hands in nervous patterns. Miss Marple had seen such gestures before, a combination of fear, guilt, and a desire to appear innocent, all tangled together. It was too early to judge, but she stored the observation quietly in her mind. Meanwhile, Inspector Cray had begun to call forward the individuals who had been nearest to the fountain. Dr. Barnaby spoke first, recounting his attempt to find a pulse, while Mrs. Tressilian described the precise moment she had seen Mr. Kensington fall. Miss Marple listened without interruption, noting discrepancies not in words, but in tone, hesitation, and the small involuntary movements accompanying each account. It was during this time that she observed something peculiar, a glint of silver beneath a bench, half hidden among the fallen petals of the peonies. Bending slightly, she retrieved a small key, its surface slightly tarnished but shaped in an unusual manner, one that suggested it belonged to neither a house door nor a common lock. Her fingers turned it thoughtfully. To the untrained eye, it was a minor curiosity. To Miss Marple, it might prove far more significant. "I wonder," she murmured to herself, "what secrets a key can hold that no lock yet reveals." The afternoon deepened, and with it, the villagers' attempts to make sense of the tragedy became more animated. Mrs. Carmichael had begun questioning Dr. Barnaby about the last time he had seen Mr. Kensington truly at ease, while Edward Harper fidgeted as he tried to respond to polite inquiries about his movements during the party. Small contradictions emerged, a timeline that did not entirely align, a glance that lingered too long, a footstep that seemed to contradict the story offered. Miss Marple noted all of it without comment. She also began to perceive the subtle undercurrents among the villagers themselves. Old resentments, minor rivalries, and quiet grievances bubbled to the surface, magnified now by fear and curiosity. Even the serene Mrs. Tressilian, whom everyone considered the embodiment of composure, revealed hints of unease when speaking about the garden arrangements or the care taken to prepare refreshments. As the sun began to dip toward the horizon, Inspector Cray finally concluded his initial questioning. He announced that the scene would remain undisturbed until a thorough search could be conducted, and that each guest should return to their homes for the evening. The villagers moved slowly, the weight of the day's horror slowing their steps. Miss Marple, however, lingered a moment longer by the fountain, turning the small key over in her hand. There was a pattern here, she thought, subtle and delicate, but unmistakable. Not all of it involved the victim, the manner in which people reacted, the small inconsistencies in their words, the faint traces left behind in the gravel and soil. They all spoke, and Miss Marple, as always, listened carefully, storing each observation, each tiny clue, until the time came to see the entire picture in its startling clarity. In the quiet that followed the departure of the last villagers, she glanced once more at the fountain and the letter opener still embedded in the stone edge. There was more than a single act at work here. This murder was no accident, no random act of violence. Somewhere, hidden beneath polite society and polite speech, lay the threads that would unravel the mystery. And Miss Marple, patient and precise, was already beginning to trace them. The next morning arrived with a muted stillness, as if the village itself had paused to recover from the shock of the previous day. The streets of St. Mary Mead were quieter than usual. Even the bakery and the post office seemed subdued, their usual cheerful chatter replaced by hushed tones and furtive glances. Miss Marple, walking slowly along the familiar lanes toward her own little cottage, observed the subtle shifts in the villagers' expressions. Anxiety, curiosity, and, here and there, a flicker of guilt mingled in ways that most would have missed entirely. By mid-morning, Inspector Cray had returned to the Tresillian estate, accompanied by a small team of officers tasked with examining the scene more thoroughly. Miss Marple, invited as a neighbor and trusted observer, joined them, though she moved quietly to the periphery, content to watch and listen while others poked and prodded. The fountain had been cordoned off, and careful photographs were taken of every angle. The letter opener had been removed and placed in a sealed evidence bag, but the soil and the gravel still bore the subtle traces of movement. Footsteps, slight disturbances, and impressions that told a story in a language only a practiced eye could read. "What a dreadful affair," Mrs. Tresillian murmured, standing nearby, her hands pressed to her chest as she watched the investigation unfold. "I cannot imagine who would wish Mr. Kensington ill. He was so charming, so urbane." Miss Marple merely inclined her head. Charm, she thought, was no safeguard against human jealousy or hidden motives. Dr. Barnaby arrived shortly, his expression a mixture of concern and mild irritation. "It is all terribly inconvenient," he remarked, brushing at his suit. "I had hoped to spend the day quietly with my books. Now we have a corpse and a key question. Why was he here, and who could have possibly—" He broke off, noticing Miss Marple watching him with those quiet, assessing eyes. "The question of motive is rarely simple," Miss Marple said softly. "Sometimes it is buried in plain sight, though no one dares to see it." As the constables examined the grounds, Miss Marple wandered near the flower beds, her gaze drawn to the faintly tarnished key she had found yesterday. Holding it in her hand, she noted the peculiar shape of its wards, the tiny scratches along its edge, and the unmistakable sense that it belonged to something important, something personal, perhaps private enough that the owner had not wanted anyone else to find it. "Curious, isn't it?" she murmured, more to herself than to anyone else. "How a small object can open doors, both literal and metaphorical." Her reflections were interrupted by the arrival of Edward Harper, who approached her hesitantly, his usual nervous energy subdued by the gravity of the situation. "Miss Marple," he began, faltering, I didn't see much yesterday, and I don't mean to intrude, but do you think anyone here could have—" His voice trailed off, uncertainty clouding his words. "Edward," Miss Marple said gently, "sometimes it is the smallest gestures that speak the loudest truths. It is rarely the grand display of intent that reveals a character, but the subtle hints, the little actions unnoticed by others." She allowed a pause, letting the words settle, then added, "Did you notice anything unusual about Mr. Kensington's behavior yesterday before it happened?" Edward hesitated, then nodded. "Yes, there was something odd. He kept looking over his shoulder, and at one point he dropped a small envelope. I didn't touch it, but, he seemed anxious, and I thought it best to leave him be." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled faintly. "A discarded envelope. That can sometimes be more revealing than an entire conversation." She stored the information carefully in her mind, noting how the smallest act, overlooked by most, might yet prove crucial. By midday, more villagers had gathered, drawn by curiosity and the need to understand the tragedy that had intruded upon their ordinary lives. Mrs. Carmichael was particularly active, circulating among the assembly with a mixture of accusation and speculation, while Dr. Barnaby sought to restore order with gentle authority. Even Mrs. Tresillian, still visibly shaken, attempted to maintain the appearance of propriety. Through it all, Miss Marple remained quietly observant. She noted the subtle tensions, the small signs of deceit or embarrassment, and the way people spoke of Mr. Kensington's arrival and demeanor. There was a web of interactions here, hidden beneath polite conversation and careful posture, and she was determined to trace every thread. Later, when the constables had concluded their initial sweep, Miss Marple lingered near the fountain once more. The gravel bore the faint traces of yesterday's turmoil, a disturbed patch of earth here, an almost imperceptible smear of mud there. She knelt briefly, fingertips brushing over the impressions, and murmured softly, "The truth often lies not in what is spoken, but in what is left behind." And as the afternoon sun began to tilt toward the horizon, casting long shadows across the lawn, she felt the first delicate stirrings of a pattern, an invisible structure connecting key, envelope, and gesture. Somewhere in this tapestry of human behavior lay the answer to the murder, though it remained hidden for now, waiting for the patient observer to reveal it. As evening settled over St. Mary Mead, a quiet unease lingered in the village air. The sun, fading behind the hedgerows, cast long, angular shadows across the cobbled streets and the well-tended gardens, lending a certain stillness to the day's earlier chaos. Most villagers had returned to their homes, yet the events of the garden party remained the subject of whispered discussion. Even the normally boisterous Dr. Barnaby moved with a measured caution, acutely aware that tragedy had visited what was usually a placid village. Miss Marple, with a small basket of knitting in hand, strolled slowly toward the Tresillian estate, where she had been invited to remain for a more private observation of the scene. Though Inspector Cray had begun to establish a routine investigation, Miss Marple was aware that official inquiry rarely penetrated the subtle layers of human behavior that often concealed the truth. She did not expect forensics or statements to provide insight into motive or intention. Rather, she relied upon what she had already noticed: the hesitation of a glance, the faint traces left on gravel and soil, and the unguarded expressions that had escaped notice. When she arrived, she found Edward Harper alone near the fountain, crouched as if attempting to examine the stones, though his posture betrayed distraction more than curiosity. He straightened hastily as Miss Marple approached. "Good evening, Miss Marple," he said, his voice unusually quiet. I was thinking about the envelope again. I wish I had picked it up. It might have mattered." Miss Marple gave a gentle nod. "Some things, Edward, are meant to be observed, not touched. Sometimes the act of noticing is enough. You did well to remember it." Her eyes rested on him for a moment, noting the nervous inflection in his speech, the way his fingers fidgeted with the edge of his sleeve. Small gestures like these were never accidental. They were interrupted by Mrs. Tresillian, who appeared at the doorway with an anxious expression. "Oh, Miss Marple, the inspector says the household may remain here tonight, but we must take care. I feel that someone unknown is watching us, or at least I imagine it. It is unsettling." Her voice trembled slightly, though she attempted to hide it behind a composed mask. Miss Marple smiled faintly. "It is natural to feel unease after such events. One does not easily forget the extraordinary in the midst of ordinary life." She glanced toward the fountain, noting once more the slight displacements in the gravel, the subtle marks that hinted at the trajectory of yesterday's actions. The murder had been swift and deliberate, and yet, as always, the small clues were left in plain sight. Edward, emboldened by Miss Marple's calm presence, spoke again. "I did notice something else. Yesterday, before everything happened. Mr. Kensington seemed interested in a particular part of the garden near the old rose arch. He kept glancing back toward it, as though he feared someone might see him." Miss Marple's eyes flicked toward the arch, where shadows had begun to lengthen as the sun sank. "And did you notice anything unusual about that area? A footprint, perhaps, or a disturbed plant?" Edward shook his head. "I only saw him glance, then move away quickly. But now that you mention it, there was a patch of soil that looked different, as if it had been recently turned." Miss Marple's lips pressed together in quiet contemplation. "The key, the envelope, the disturbed soil. All were small, seemingly trivial details, yet together they suggested an interaction that no one else had noticed. Something had been hidden there, something that had drawn Mr. Kensington's attention and perhaps, ultimately, led to his death. Mrs. Tressilian clutched her shawl tighter. "You think someone here knows more than they admit," she whispered. "Perhaps," Miss Marple said softly. "But knowledge is often hidden in the smallest gestures and in the way people avoid the truth as much as in the way they seek it. One observes, and slowly the picture emerges." As twilight deepened, Miss Marple walked slowly along the edge of the garden, her eyes scanning the subtle disturbances. A trampled flower, a faint scuff in the gravel, a glimmer of silver that might otherwise have been overlooked. Each tiny sign told a story, and each story, when pieced together, would reveal the path that led to the unfortunate Mr. Kensington. Inside the house, a quiet tension had begun to settle among the servants, who spoke in low tones about the curious events and the peculiar behavior of the visitors. Miss Marple, seated near the fireplace with her knitting once more, allowed them their observations. Villagers often betrayed their own secrets when speaking of others, and she, as always, listened with patience and care. By the time darkness had fully fallen, it was clear that the murder was only the surface of a deeper complexity. Small clues, minor gestures, and overlooked interactions formed the beginning of a tapestry that Miss Marple was slowly unraveling. The village, outwardly serene, held undercurrents of tension and hidden motives, and somewhere within that quiet, seemingly ordinary life, the truth awaited, patiently hidden in plain sight. The next morning brought with it a crisp, almost startling clarity, as though the village itself had woken with a sharper eye, aware that yesterday's calm had been irrevocably broken. Miss Marple, taking her usual early walk along the narrow lanes, noted that the villagers moved with a quiet tension. Conversations were carefully measured, eyes darting as though each glance might reveal some hidden knowledge, some culpable awareness. Even the postman, ordinarily unconcerned with anything beyond letters and parcels, carried a subdued air, as though sensing that the ordinary rhythm of St. Mary Mead had been disturbed. By mid-morning, Inspector Cray had begun interviews with the villagers in a more formal setting. The drawing-room at the Tressilian estate, with its lace curtains and polished oak furniture, now held the air of a temporary courtroom. Mrs. Tressilian, pale but resolute, insisted upon maintaining appearances, while Dr. Barnaby offered assistance in recounting events to the inspector, trying to lend both clarity and calm. Miss Marple, seated quietly near the window, observed in her customary manner, listening as much to what was unsaid as to the spoken words. The questioning revealed little that was immediately useful. Witnesses recalled fragmented moments, the glint of sunlight on a silver cufflink, the distant sound of a laugh, the faint odor of damp soil, each recollection colored by shock or the desire to appear composed. Yet even in these imperfect statements, Miss Marple found the subtle threads of human behavior she had learned to trust. Small inconsistencies, the hesitation before answering, a fleeting glance toward the door, a too rapid change of subject, hinted at deeper truths. Edward Harper was brought forward once more. His hands fidgeted with the cuffs of his jacket, the nervous energy of yesterday lingering in his posture. I noticed something," he began, voice low, "though I'm not sure it matters. Mr. Kensington, he received a visitor before the party. I didn't see who it was, but they spoke near the Rose Arch for a few minutes, and he seemed troubled." Miss Marple's eyes lifted, the faintest spark of interest showing. A visitor at that precise location, before the events of yesterday, could explain several anomalies she had already noted. The disturbed soil, Mr. Kensington's furtive glances, the discarded envelope Edward had mentioned. She stored the information quietly, careful not to reveal the significance, knowing that attention could easily disrupt the natural behavior she relied upon for insight. Meanwhile, Mrs. Carmichael had begun questioning the servants, pressing them for recollections of visitors, odd deliveries, and any unusual behavior in the household. Her questions, though pointed and intrusive, produced small revelations. A forgotten parcel left at the gate, a fleeting exchange of words near the fountain, the sound of hurried footsteps that had gone unnoticed amidst the party's initial excitement. Each fragment was minor, almost irrelevant in isolation, yet to Miss Marple they formed the beginnings of a pattern, a hidden narrative emerging beneath the veneer of village civility. Later in the day, as the inspector reviewed his notes, Miss Marple took the opportunity to wander near the rose arch once more. The soil there was uneven, faintly pressed by footprints that suggested more than one person had stood in the spot. She knelt carefully, brushing her fingers over the disturbed earth. The glimmer of the small silver key in her hand seemed to resonate with this sight. There was a connection here, subtle and precise, though the nature of it remained obscured by circumstance and fear. From her vantage point, she observed Edward Harper pacing nervously at the edge of the garden, then Dr. Barnaby consulting with a servant who had noticed a fleeting shadow near the arch during the party. The villagers themselves moved like pieces on a board, each gesture and hesitation telling a story. Miss Marple allowed herself a quiet smile. The threads were beginning to intertwine. As evening approached, she returned to the house, carrying her thoughts like a carefully stacked pile of correspondence, each observation waiting to be read in sequence. The household was quieter now, the servants settling into a subdued routine, the guests long since departed. Yet beneath this surface calm, Miss Marple sensed the undercurrents of anxiety, secrecy, and hidden motives that had always accompanied tragedy in human life. She paused by the fireplace, the small silver key resting in her palm. So many things hidden in plain sight, she murmured softly, more to herself than to anyone else. The smallest act, the tiniest gesture, and yet it can change the course of a life, or end it. The day had yielded fragments, hints, and subtle anomalies. None were sufficient alone to reveal the murderer, but together, carefully observed and patiently pieced together, they were forming the outline of a truth that was both inevitable and deeply human. Miss Marple, with her quiet patience and her gentle insistence upon observation, was already beginning to see how the picture might emerge. The following morning arrived with a muted grey light, the kind that softened edges and cast even familiar objects into slightly unfamiliar shapes. The village of St. Mary Mead felt slower, as though reluctant to resume ordinary life. Miss Marple, taking her habitual early walk, observed the subtle shifts in the faces she passed, furtive glances, hesitant nods, and the occasional tightened jaw. The murder had introduced an invisible tension, one that lingered even in the smallest interactions. By mid-morning, Inspector Cray had begun a more systematic examination of the household and grounds, and Miss Marple had returned with him, quietly seated in the drawing-room, knitting her thoughts as she did her yarn. Dr. Barnaby had insisted upon staying to provide calm assistance, while Mrs. Tressilian attempted to maintain composure, though the faint lines around her eyes betrayed her lingering anxiety. Edward Harper approached Miss Marple again, his nervous energy barely contained. "Miss Marple, there's something else I noticed," he began, voice low. "Yesterday, before everything happened, Mr. Kensington seemed distracted, almost agitated. He kept glancing toward the rose arch and then toward the fountain. He whispered to someone I couldn't see. His words trailed off, uncertainty softening his voice. Miss Marple inclined her head slightly. "Thank you, Edward. It is often the smallest details, whispered or overlooked, that hold the greatest significance. And you saw what others did not. Notice how he looked, whom he spoke to, and where he lingered. These are clues in themselves." Her attention drifted again to the rose arch, where yesterday's disturbances had occurred. The soil was slightly damp and uneven. Small impressions suggesting hurried footsteps, multiple visits, or perhaps a struggle hidden from casual notice. Miss Marple touched the earth lightly, then glanced at the small silver key she still carried. There was a connection here, delicate and precise, though not immediately obvious to anyone else. As the inspector questioned more villagers individually, Miss Marple moved quietly about the estate. She noticed the subtle reactions of those present, the way Mrs. Carmichael's eyes lingered too long on the servants, the tight clench of Dr. Barnaby's jaw when asked about Mr. Kensington's last movements, and Edward Harper's constant, nervous shifting. Each gesture, each hesitation, was a thread in the emerging tapestry of events. A servant approached her cautiously. "Miss Marple, if I may. I thought I saw something odd near the old tool shed yesterday. A figure, perhaps, slipping away after the commotion by the fountain. I did not think it important at the time." Miss Marple's eyes brightened imperceptibly. Sometimes what seems unimportant is precisely the key to understanding. Thank you for mentioning it. She stored the information carefully, adding it to the mental map she was constructing. Later in the morning, the constables discovered a small, discarded envelope near the Rose Arch, the one Edward had mentioned. Miss Marple, who had anticipated its presence, examined it discreetly. Inside was a folded note with handwriting that seemed hurried, almost disguised, yet it bore a few key words that suggested secrecy, urgency, and, most importantly, a personal connection to the victim. "The pattern is beginning to reveal itself," Miss Marple murmured, more to herself than anyone else. "The visitor, the key, the envelope. Each element, small on its own, forms part of a much larger design." By afternoon, tension had begun to mount among the villagers. Rumors swirled and whispered accusations began to surface, though no one dared speak openly. Mrs. Carmichael, ever eager to sow intrigue, circulated among the rooms, her questions probing, her gaze sharp. Dr. Barnaby attempted to calm the conversations, but even he could not suppress the growing unease. Miss Marple, however, remained a quiet center amid the turbulence, observing, noting, and connecting each subtle indication of motive, fear, or deceit. She had seen enough now to know that the murder was not a simple act of violence or chance. It was deliberate, calculated, and, most tellingly, entwined with the personal dynamics and secrets that lay hidden in the heart of St. Mary Mead. As the sun began to lower itself behind the hedgerows, casting the estate in long shadows, Miss Marple paused once more at the Rose Arch. The disturbed soil, the impressions of hurried footsteps, and the faint glimmer of the silver key in her hand were threads she would continue to follow. Somewhere, just beyond the reach of casual observation, lay the answer to the curious case, a truth that was both human and inevitable, waiting only for the patient eye to perceive it fully. By the following morning, the unease in St. Mary Mead had thickened, settling over the village like a slow fog. Though the streets appeared calm, every glance and every movement carried a shadow of yesterday's violence. Miss Marple, walking along the familiar lanes, noticed it in the way shopkeepers paused mid-action to exchange hushed words, and in the occasional flinch when a stranger's voice rose too sharply. Even the usually indifferent cats and dogs seemed aware of a subtle tension that had entered the village's daily life. At the Tresillian estate, Miss Marple found the household quieter than usual. The servants moved carefully, aware of the scrutiny of the constables and of their own observations. Mrs. Tresillian, pale but composed, had insisted that the estate remain open for those who might assist in clarifying the events of the garden party. Dr. Barnaby had arrived early, his expression clouded with both concern and an undercurrent of impatience, an impatience born of being so close to events that he could not yet fully comprehend. Miss Marple, seated near the window with her knitting basket, observed the morning rituals with her customary patience. She noted the subtle ways in which the villagers carried themselves, the slight stiffness of Dr. Barnaby's posture, Edward Harper's restless hands, and Mrs. Carmichael's sharp, deliberate glances that sought to unsettle those around her. Each of these small signals added to the growing mosaic she was piecing together. Edward approached her cautiously, holding a small folded piece of paper in his hand. "Miss Marple," he said in a low voice, I found this near the Rose Arch early this morning. I thought perhaps it belonged to Mr. Kensington. I wasn't sure it was important." Miss Marple took the note carefully, her fingers brushing over the paper as if it were another layer of the story waiting to be unfolded. The handwriting was hurried, nearly illegible in places, but there were key phrases that suggested urgency and secrecy. It hinted at arrangements, meetings, and a personal matter that would not have been shared publicly. Her mind began tracing the connections between the note, the silver key, and the visitor Edward had mentioned, recognizing the invisible threads that linked them. As the morning wore on, a second development caught the household by surprise. A local delivery man arrived, claiming he had been asked to leave a small parcel for Mr. Kensington earlier in the week, but had been unable to locate him until now. Inside was a small, intricately carved box. Its contents, once examined, revealed a second key, similar in design to the one Miss Marple had found, but slightly larger and bearing the faint initials AK. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed subtly. 2 keys, a mysterious note, and a visitor whose presence had gone unnoticed by nearly everyone. These were not coincidences. The puzzle pieces were beginning to converge, forming a pattern that implicated more than just the immediate act of violence. Dr. Barnaby, observing her reaction, leaned closer. "You seem intrigued, Miss Marple," he said, though his tone carried neither accusation nor question, merely a statement of fact. "Curiosity is not always the same as suspicion," she replied softly, turning the key over in her hand. "It is the quiet observation of small details that often reveals more than loud declarations ever could, and in a case like this, the smallest detail is rarely the least important." By midday, whispers had begun circulating among the villagers once more, fueled by the discovery of the second key. Mrs. Carmichael had taken to questioning anyone who would listen, suggesting hidden affairs, clandestine meetings, and motives tied to long-standing grievances. Edward Harper, meanwhile, grew increasingly nervous, darting glances toward the Rose Arch and the fountain as if afraid to linger too long in any one spot. Miss Marple, however, remained calm and deliberate. She had already begun mapping the connections: the first key, the second key, the visitor at the Rose Arch, the hurried note, and the body in the garden. Each element spoke not merely of opportunity, but of intent, design, and the subtle psychological maneuvers of someone intent on concealment. As evening fell, Miss Marple lingered by the fountain, examining the disturbed gravel and the soil near the Rose Arch one last time. Her mind traced the steps, gestures, and choices of each person involved, reconstructing the sequence that had led to Mr. Kensington's death. Somewhere within these careful observations, she knew, lay the truth, a truth that required patience, subtlety, and the willingness to look beyond what was plainly visible. And in the quiet of the fading light, Miss Marple felt a faint but unmistakable certainty. The case was far from simple, but the strands were beginning to weave together in a pattern that only a careful and unhurried mind could follow. The hidden motives, the secrets of the heart, and the small telling gestures would, in time, reveal the identity of the murderer, and she would be ready when they did. The following morning, the air in St. Mary Mead carried a tension that seemed almost tangible, pressing lightly against the cottages, the hedgerows, and the narrow lanes. The villagers, each wrapped in their own unease, spoke in cautious whispers, as though the slightest careless word might invite disaster. Miss Marple, walking along the familiar route to the Tresillian estate, noted with quiet satisfaction that she could now perceive the subtle rhythms of anxiety and evasion among them. The quickened step, the half-turned glance, the slight avoidance of eye contact. By mid-morning, Inspector Cray had begun piecing together a tentative timeline of the events surrounding Mr. Kensington's death. Statements were compared, contradictions noted, and the pattern of arrivals, departures, and minor interactions charted with methodical precision. Yet, for all the diligence of the official inquiry, it was Miss Marple who quietly noted what the formal questioning overlooked. The weight of hesitation, the insistence upon trivial detail, and the small, revealing gestures that betrayed far more than words could. Edward Harper approached her again, the nervous energy that had characterized him from the outset, now tinged with something closer to dread. "Miss Marple," he whispered, "I think I remember something. Something I didn't understand yesterday. When Mr. Kensington dropped the envelope, I saw a glimpse of someone near the garden wall. Just a shadow, really, but they moved away so quickly I thought I imagined it." Miss Marple's eyes sharpened imperceptibly. "A shadow," she murmured, "and yet shadows often carry far more truth than light does. Thank you, Edward. Keep that in mind. It may prove significant." She stored the information carefully, filing it alongside the first key, the second key, the envelope, and the visitor Edward had noticed near the rose arch. The pieces of the puzzle were accumulating, and each, seemingly minor in isolation, now pressed together into a pattern too deliberate to ignore. Later, as the villagers gathered again, drawn by curiosity and the natural pull of human concern, Miss Marple observed a subtle shift in behavior. Mrs. Carmichael, ever keen to dominate attention, had begun to insinuate connections between Mr. Kensington and certain local figures, though she had no proof. Dr. Barnaby, for all his composure, betrayed a faint tension in his hands and jaw, a silent acknowledgement that there was more to the events than could be captured by an official report. Miss Marple turned her attention once more to the rose arch. The soil beneath it, lightly disturbed in the days since the murder, bore faint signs of repeated footsteps. The pattern suggested a deliberate placement, perhaps the concealment of an object, perhaps the meeting of two individuals whose intentions were hidden from the casual observer. The silver keys she now held, the original one she had discovered and the second delivered in the parcel, seemed to belong to these movements, to be the silent instruments of access or secrecy. By afternoon, the situation took a subtle but telling turn. A servant, emboldened by curiosity and a measure of trust in Miss Marple, mentioned that they had noticed an unfamiliar scent lingering near the rose arch yesterday. A faint trace of perfume, floral and slightly sharp, that did not belong to any of the guests or residents. The observation was almost casual, but to Miss Marple it provided a new layer to the unfolding narrative. The presence of someone whose identity had not yet been accounted for, someone whose very essence left a trace, added a critical element to the emerging picture. Miss Marple, sitting quietly by the fountain as evening fell, allowed herself a rare moment of reflection. The threads were now numerous but distinct. The envelope, the first key, the second key, the shadow near the wall, the visitor at the rose arch, the faint perfume, and the subtle behaviors of those closest to the scene. Each was a fragment, and each fragment was a story in itself, one that, when interwoven with the others, would reveal the true sequence of events. She considered the villagers' interactions, the minor contradictions, and the psychological undercurrents she had observed. There was a deliberate concealment at work, a careful choreography of appearances and distractions. And she knew, with the quiet certainty that had guided her through so many mysteries, that the revelation was approaching. The final piece, the moment when a small action or a slight reaction would betray the true murderer, was almost within reach. As the shadows lengthened across the garden and the roses bowed under the evening light, Miss Marple allowed herself a faint, knowing smile. The puzzle was nearly complete, and soon, very soon, the hidden truth would emerge from the quiet fabric of St. Mary Mead, exposing the carefully concealed motives and unmasking the hand that had committed such a deliberate act. The following morning, St. Mary Mead seemed to breathe more heavily, as though the village itself had become aware that the calm it had long taken for granted was no longer possible. The early light fell softly on hedgerows and cottages, but beneath the quiet exterior, the villagers carried the weight of unease with them. Miss Marple, as always, walked along the familiar paths with her knitting basket, her eyes noting small signs, half-hidden expressions, averted glances, and nervous hesitations that might have escaped less observant eyes. Inside the Tresillian estate, the household had settled into a tense routine. Servants moved quietly, careful not to draw attention, while Dr. Barnaby reviewed his notes with measured focus. Mrs. Tresillian, still pallid from the events of the previous days, attempted to maintain composure, though her hands betrayed her anxiety with occasional tremors. Miss Marple, seated near the window, observed them all with her usual calm attention, noting the way each person interacted with the others and how subtle tensions had begun to emerge. Edward Harper approached her once more, clutching the small silver keys in one hand and the folded envelope in the other. "Miss Marple," he said softly, I think I understand something now. Yesterday, before the tragedy, Mr. Kensington was trying to hide something near the Rose Arch. He kept glancing back, almost as if he feared someone might follow him. Miss Marple's eyes flicked toward the arch, noting the uneven soil and the faint impressions of hurried footsteps. "And you observed these things without interference?" she asked gently. Edward nodded. I stayed back. I didn't want to be involved. But now I wonder, perhaps someone else saw too, and perhaps they acted." Miss Marple considered this quietly. The threads were now numerous: the 2 keys, the envelope, Edward's observation of the visitor near the arch, the faint perfume noted by the servant, and the shadow near the garden wall. Each seemed trivial in isolation, yet together they hinted at a carefully orchestrated chain of events. By late morning, Miss Marple had devised a subtle test. She called Edward to her side and began a casual conversation about the events of the garden party, allowing her to guide the discussion toward the Rose Arch and the movements of various guests. Her questions were gentle, seemingly innocent, but they were crafted to elicit small, unguarded reactions. She noticed a faint change in Edward's demeanor when she mentioned the envelope, and a barely perceptible tension in Mrs. Carmichael's posture when the conversation turned toward visitors who had come and gone unnoticed. Miss Marple's mind worked quietly, piecing together the narrative hidden beneath layers of politeness, fear, and self-preservation. The envelope had been intended to conceal a secret. The keys suggested access and knowledge restricted to a select few. The shadow and the perfume indicated the presence of someone who had not yet been accounted for. Each detail reinforced a pattern of deception, subtle but deliberate, crafted to mislead and confuse. As afternoon approached, she quietly observed the villagers' movements. Dr. Barnaby, Edward, and even Mrs. Tresillian unconsciously revealed the pressures of secrecy. Slight hesitations, redirected glances, and small, telling gestures. Miss Marple noted them all, understanding that human behavior, even when disguised, rarely lies completely. The murderer had underestimated the quiet attentiveness of her mind. Finally, with a calmness that belied the weight of revelation, Miss Marple stood and addressed the gathered household. Her voice was gentle but firm, carrying a quiet authority that immediately commanded attention. "It is often the smallest details," she began, "that reveal the largest truths. A note, a key, the faint scent of a flower, and a hurried glance. Each of these, seemingly insignificant, speaks volumes when considered together." All eyes turned to her as she continued, methodically and subtly, tracing the movements and actions of the past days. She spoke of the visitor near the Rose Arch, the envelope dropped by Mr. Kensington, the disturbed soil, and the shadows that had been glimpsed near the wall. Each revelation, delivered with calm clarity, pointed toward a single conclusion. "And so," Miss Marple said finally, her gaze sweeping the room with quiet inevitability, "the person who sought to conceal these actions, who manipulated appearances and misdirected attention, is none other than the individual who had both opportunity and motive, and who allowed themselves to be seen only in the briefest of moments." A hush fell over the room. Faces turned pale, expressions shifted, and small gasps escaped from those who had not realized the full extent of the deception. Miss Marple, with a faint, knowing smile, allowed the realization to settle. The subtle psychological cues, the hidden keys, the discarded envelope, and the overlooked gestures had all converged to reveal the truth. The murderer had been hiding in plain sight, their calm exterior masking the careful orchestration of a fatal act. And as the villagers absorbed the quiet yet undeniable revelation, Miss Marple returned to her chair near the window, her knitting in hand, reflecting once more on the delicate, intricate patterns of human behavior, patterns that, when observed patiently and with care, could always illuminate the darkest of secrets. The revelation, though delivered with Miss Marple's customary gentleness, reverberated through the Tresillian estate like a silent chime, leaving every listener to grapple with the weight of truth. Faces that had seemed composed just moments before now flickered with shock, disbelief, and, in some cases, faint relief that the puzzle had finally been unraveled. Miss Marple allowed a pause, giving each individual the quiet space to digest her careful exposition, knowing that abrupt insistence often met resistance, whereas a patient unfolding invited acceptance. Edward Harper, still clutching the 2 keys and the envelope, shifted uncomfortably. His wide eyes met hers, seeking guidance without words. Miss Marple offered a subtle nod, acknowledging his courage in observing what others had ignored. "Edward," she said softly, "your careful attention, your willingness to notice even the smallest detail, has been invaluable. It is precisely such quiet observation that allows truth to emerge from the tangle of appearances." Mrs. Carmichael, never one to hide her emotions, flared with indignation. "Surely you cannot mean to suggest—" she began, only to falter under the weight of Miss Marple's steady gaze. "The truth, Mrs. Carmichael," Miss Marple replied evenly, "is seldom convenient or comfortable. It rests not upon speculation, but upon the consistent pattern of behavior, the small inconsistencies and the subtle signs that indicate motive and opportunity. When these are considered together, the outline of events becomes unmistakably clear." Dr. Barnaby, who had spent the last few hours observing rather than speaking, leaned forward, his hands folded in front of him. "And you are confident," he asked cautiously, "that these observations are sufficient, that the threads you have followed truly lead to the one responsible?" Miss Marple's lips curved faintly into a quiet smile. "Confidence is a delicate thing, Doctor, built not on certainty alone, but on the careful consideration of human nature. The evidence of character, timing, hesitation, gesture, and subtle misdirection is often far more revealing than a loud declaration or a hasty accusation. And in this case, the evidence has spoken plainly to those who know how to listen." A servant, who had lingered quietly in the doorway, now approached with a shadow of curiosity and relief on her face. "Miss Marple," she whispered, "I think I understand now. The way the footsteps were, and the keys, and the envelope, it all makes sense." "Exactly," Miss Marple said softly. "It is the small, seemingly trivial elements, observed patiently and connected thoughtfully, that reveal the truth hidden beneath appearances. The person who acted with deliberate intent left behind the faintest traces, enough for careful observation to discern their path." As the day deepened into afternoon, Inspector Cray began the delicate task of taking formal statements and arranging for the appropriate course of action regarding the murderer. Miss Marple, meanwhile, returned once more to the rose arch and the fountain, her eyes scanning the subtle impressions left in the soil, the gravel, and the flower beds. Every detail reaffirmed her conclusions, each whisper of evidence fitting seamlessly into the larger picture she had long discerned. The villagers, though unsettled, gradually began to accept the truth, recognizing the intricate human behaviors that had concealed it, the subtle deceptions, the quiet misdirections, the carefully maintained facades. All had been laid bare by Miss Marple's calm and unassuming scrutiny. There was a mixture of relief and lingering unease, for while the immediate danger had been identified, the knowledge of such deliberate intent in their midst left an indelible mark upon their perceptions of one another. By evening, the Tresillian estate had settled into a tentative stillness. Miss Marple, seated near the window with her knitting in hand, observed the golden light of the late sun touching the garden, reflecting faintly upon the silver keys and the envelope that had been central to unraveling the mystery. In the quiet, she reflected on the patterns of human behavior, the subtle ways in which intent could be traced through gesture and observation, in the importance of patient, careful attention to detail. The murder, though shocking, had revealed not only the truth about one individual's actions, but also the complex web of relationships, motives, and minor deceptions that quietly shaped life in St. Mary Mead. Miss Marple, as ever, remained the calm observer at the center, understanding that while the village would eventually resume its familiar rhythm, it would never be quite the same. And she, as always, would watch and listen, ready to discern the truths that only careful attention and a patient mind could uncover. By the following morning, a quiet had settled over St. Mary Mead, heavier and more reflective than before. The usual village bustle moved with restraint, as if everyone were conscious of the recent revelations and the truths they had laid bare. Miss Marple, walking along the familiar lanes with her basket of knitting, observed the subtle transformations in the villagers' faces, relief mingled with lingering apprehension, curiosity tempered by prudence. There was a new awareness now, a recognition that beneath the ordinary rhythms of life, human intentions could conceal depths of subtlety, cunning, and even malice. At the Tresillian estate, the household moved with a careful rhythm. The servants, though polite and composed, occasionally exchanged glances that acknowledged the events of the past days, while Dr. Barnaby quietly tended to practical matters, ensuring that the estate resumed function without ignoring the recent tragedy. Mrs. Tresillian, still pallid but now steadied by the knowledge that the murderer had been identified, moved with a cautious grace, as though reconciling the familiar order of the household with the shocking disruption it had suffered. Miss Marple, seated near the window with her knitting in hand, observed these movements with calm satisfaction. She reflected on the intricate patterns she had traced, the careful orchestration of the keys, the envelope, the subtle gestures, and the hidden presence of a visitor whose identity had initially been obscured. Each element had been a thread in a larger tapestry, and together they had revealed a truth that was both inevitable and thoroughly human. As the villagers began to speak more freely, sharing observations and reflecting on their own roles, however minor, in the unfolding of events, Miss Marple listened attentively. She noted how the revelation had altered their perceptions, how fear and suspicion had given way to a cautious appreciation of human complexity. Even Mrs. Carmichael, whose curiosity and gossip had once threatened to disrupt the investigation, now accepted the resolution with a grudging acknowledgement of Miss Marple's insight. Edward Harper, still clutching the keys and the envelope, approached Miss Marple one last time. I understand now," he said softly. "I see how every little thing mattered. The envelope, the keys, the visitor, the footsteps. It all fit together, and I suppose we were fortunate that someone noticed it all. Miss Marple smiled gently. Fortune, Edward, is often less about chance and more about attention. It is in observing, in considering, and in understanding that the hidden truths reveal themselves. You, too, played a small part by noticing what others overlooked. As the sun began its descent, casting warm golden light across the garden, Miss Marple took a final walk along the familiar paths of the estate. The rose arch, the fountain, and the disturbed gravel were now symbols not only of the crime, but of the careful study and quiet patience required to unravel it. She reflected on the village, on the enduring patterns of human behavior, and on the lessons embedded in ordinary interactions that, when combined, could illuminate the darkest of acts. By evening, St. Mary Mead had settled once more into its usual rhythm, though now with a subtle awareness that beneath the familiar calm, life was shaped by unseen forces, hidden motives, and the quiet intelligence of those who observed them. Miss Marple returned to her cozy chair, knitting in hand, content to watch, to listen, and to reflect. The village had restored its outward tranquility, but she knew, as she always did, that human nature retained its intricate complexity, and that truth, when approached with patience and discernment, would always find a way to reveal itself. And so, the curious case of the second key concluded, leaving behind a village forever slightly altered, a household reconciled with both grief and understanding, and a Miss Marple once again quietly satisfied that observation, patience, and insight had prevailed over deception and secrecy. The day ended not with dramatic fanfare, but with the gentle certainty that in St. Mary Mead, life, complex, human, and observant, would continue.